Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the goose-feathered slippers of confusion because we're about to debunk 5 historical myths everyone still believes. Forget what your middle school teacher insisted. Ignore your uncle's oddly aggressive opinions at Thanksgiving, and especially forget that one meme you saw at 2 a.m. We're diving deep into the swirling soup of misunderstood history. This isn't the sanitized storybook version. This is real history, muddier, smellier, and somehow even more confusing than trying to program your smart TV remote after 3 glasses of wine. Before we leap into the misconceptions that haunt your trivia nights, take a second to like, subscribe, and, if you genuinely enjoy this absurd insomnia fuel, drop a comment telling me which historical myth you believed for way too long. Now, dim those lights, put your fan on low for that perfect white noise, and wriggle deep into your bed. Ask yourself, who really invented the light bulb? Did Vikings actually wear horned helmets? Or did they just want us to think they looked cool on Halloween? Was Napoleon truly pocket-sized? Or is that just British propaganda that stuck? Did people in the Middle Ages really think the Earth was flat? Or is that flat out wrong? Could you actually kill someone with a medieval tomato? Or is that about as likely as finding gluten-free bread in ancient Rome? So, grab your metaphorical time travel passport, because you've just woken up somewhere between myth and reality. The year, irrelevant. Your mission? Survive the night without falling for history's oldest scams. For years you've heard it. The Great Wall of China is the only man-made object visible from space. Spoiler alert, if astronauts can spot your cousin's backyard trampoline from orbit, maybe it's time to get those windows cleaned. Journey with me through crumbling ramparts, overgrown stones, and enough tourist litter to assemble a small spacecraft, where we'll ask, how did this myth get so astronomically out of control? The claim stretches back further than most people think. The idea that humankind could etch something so massive onto the planet that it would announce our presence to anyone orbiting above. It's deliciously dramatic. But is it true? Well, the answer is cosmic, in both the celestial sense and the sense that it's a big, fat space whopper. Let's take a stroll back to the early 20th century, when space travel was a twinkle in an inventor's eye. As early as 1938, in Ripley's Believe It or Not, the notion was already being trumpeted. Apparently, if you wanted to get into the record books, all you needed was several thousand miles of winding brickwork and a capacity for enduring centuries of Chinese dynastic squabbles. The myth snowballed with the rise of modern space exploration. When American astronaut Alan Bean landed on the moon in 1969, he was fairly clear. The only thing you can see from the moon is a beautiful sphere, mostly white, some blue, spots of yellow, and every once in a while, some green vegetation. Sorry, Wall, no curtain call on the lunar stage for you. Later, Chinese astronaut Yang Liwei confirmed what generations of space tourists have since corroborated. No, the wall does not turn up waving on the horizon when you cruise Earth's exosphere. So why did the idea stick with us? Some myths persist because they're just so satisfying. The wall, with its 1,000-year-old battlements and mythic serpentine route, seems like Earth's secret handshake. A sure sign to any passing alien civilization. Hey, intelligent life here, and we build really, really long things. But consider this. From a low Earth orbit, about 350 kilometers up, astronauts can technically spot man-made structures, but they're not exactly easy to pick out. Airports, big highways, and even whole cities appear as subtle patches and smudges, not crisp icons. The Great Wall itself. From that height, it's about as visible as a human hair from the other end of a football field. and often camouflaged by the stone and soil around it. And for anyone banking on seeing the wall from the actual moon, keep dreaming. At nearly 400,000 kilometers away, not even the most eagle-eyed stargazer or Google Maps enthusiast could spot a single human construction from the lunar surface. But let's grant the myth its due. The wall's true grandeur shines brightest up close. Amble along its winding stones, and you brush against centuries of empire, ingenious engineering, bone-aching labour, shifting frontiers, a structure so ambitious that it twisted geography and culture right along with it. The truth is more impressive than the myth. Not that it's visible from the heavens, but that it still stands on Earth after battling storms, earthquakes, and nearly every dynasty's bureaucratic infighting. Sometimes, the hardest thing to see is what's right in front of us. The wall doesn't need cosmic endorsement. It's a monument to human creativity, determination, and, let's be honest, a dash of insecurity about the neighbours. So, the next time someone repeats that old cosmic chestnut at a dinner party or in a quiz night showdown, you've got the facts and a great story to go with it. Because in the end, what's more stellar? A wall visible from the stars, or a myth that's travelled around the world without even leaving the ground? You wake up in a smoky hall, surrounded by burly men gleaming with questionable hygiene. Someone shouts, "Where's your helmet, and why doesn't it have horns?" Horned helmets, history's greatest fashion fail. We'll sort out how this myth sprouted, and why your childhood Viking costume just became historically inaccurate cosplay. Let's set the scene. The year is somewhere between 800 and 1100 AD. Scandinavia is chilly, morale is high, and axes are apparently the must-have accessory du jour. But look a little closer at those iconic Norse warriors milling about. Notice something. Not a single person in the room seems to be sporting a pair of antlers, bison horns, or even a stylish unicorn spike on their helmet. The reality is as unembellished as boiled turnips. Vikings simply didn't wear horned helmets into battle. In fact, the closest thing Old Norse folks put on their heads was pragmatic. Sturdy, conical iron hats with nose guards, built for function, not feistiness. So why do the horns persist in popular imagination? To answer that, we need to step away from Scandinavian sagas for a moment and enter the world of 19th century Europe, a place where opera divas, eccentric painters, and antiquarians with enthusiastic moustache-twirling skills decide what Viking should look like. Spoiler, they go big on the drama. In Richard Wagner's epic opera Der Ring des Nibelungen, costume designers decked out Viking characters in ornate helmets, bristling with massive horns, seemingly better for jousting at local cattle competitions than withstanding a sword fight. This stage spectacle left a deep impression, fixing horned headgear firmly in the cultural memory. Let's be honest, horns are dramatic. They transform even the humblest headpiece into an instant proclamation. Here stands someone who means business. They also make it very hard to fit through a doorway. Archaeologists, with their usual party-pooping attention to detail, have found no clear evidence of Vikings storming monasteries with horns attached to their noggins. The scant horned helmets, unearthed across Europe, date from earlier eras, like the Bronze Age, and were likely intended for ceremonial or religious use. In battle, pure liability. Nothing says, "grab me here," quite like a perfectly grabbable pair of antlers in hand-to-hand combat. But let's not throw your dress-up box into the fjord just yet. The Viking horned helmet fantasy persists, not because historians lack imagination, but because horns make for fantastic marketing. Think cereal boxes, comic books, or Halloween costumes. Children's illustrators never met an inconvenient truth they couldn't ignore for a splash of pizzazz. Horns just look cool. And for a culture obsessed with stories and spectacle, cool sometimes trumps accurate. Yet, unmasking this myth is a chance to meet the Norse on their own terms. Fearless sailors, creative traders, expert shipbuilders. These guys changed the map and left an imprint so deep, we're still arguing about their headgear 1,000 years later. Their actual helmets, when worn, spoke of practicality over panache, better protection, fewer awkward accidents at feasting tables. Imagine trying to clink drinking horns with a friend, only to accidentally poke out someone's eye. So next time you're at a historical reenactment, take a moment to appreciate the unadorned ironwork of true Viking helmets, free from bovine embellishments. And if you spot someone in a horned helmet, don't scold, offer them the lead role in next year's Wagner production. After all, history and myth often share a stage, and on the catwalk of imagination, horns will always be in vogue, even if they never made it out of the costume department. In short, if you want to blend in with Viking Age Scandinavians, ditch the horns. If you want to win the costume contest, by all means, let your inner opera star shine. Just remember, the real Vikings never needed horns to be legendary. It's the eve of revolution, and you're starving. Across the city, peasants are allegedly grumbling about cake, and a certain queen is rolling her eyes so hard it's a miracle she can still see. Did she really tell people to eat cake? Or was that just a lie with extra frosting? Let's rewind to 18th century France, a nation teetering between opulence and disaster. In the shadowy halls of Versailles, gossip moved faster than the palace horses. The people were angry, bread prices were soaring, and political pamphlets were multiplying like rabbits. In this climate of unrest, rumour became its own form of currency, and no one's reputation was more fragile or more ripe for confectionery slander than Marie Antoinette's. The iconic phrase, "Let them eat cake," or as the French put it, "qu'ils mangent de la brioche," is universally attributed to Marie Antoinette. But here's the twist. There's no record of her actually uttering these words. It's more likely to be a wickedly effective piece of propaganda. The origins of the phrase trace back not to the ill-fated queen, but to the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who wrote about a great princess, saying this like a line in his Confessions, a book published when Marie was just 9 years old and not yet arrived at the French court. So, unless young Marie was moonlighting as a time-travelling meme generator, history has played a little trick on her image. So why did this sticky sweet rumour stick? Consider the context. Marie Antoinette was a foreigner, an Austrian archduchess in a nation deeply suspicious of outsiders. Her lavish lifestyle and the kaleidoscopic parties of Versailles became easy targets for public rage. When bread was scarce, stories about the Queen's excesses helped channel frustration into a singular, memorable villain. Cakegate, if you will. But let's be clear. Cake, here, wasn't even cake as we picture it today. There were no layers of buttery sponge or showers of confetti sprinkles. Brioche was a richer, more expensive bread, out of reach for the average worker. The very idea that the ruling class was blind to the plight of the people became condensed into this single, pointed phrase. It became a kind of shorthand for royal obliviousness. And here's where reality gets frosted with myth. There's little evidence Marie Antoinette was so clueless about hunger. In fact, records show she supported charitable causes, donated to the poor, and even implemented reforms in her own household to cut extravagant spending. But in the face of systematic hardship and public anger, facts were drowned out by clever lies. A catchy quote wields far more power than a detailed financial ledger ever could. What this tells us isn't just about Marie Antoinette. It's about us, and how stories, sweetened or soured, take on lives of their own. The Queen's supposed cake comment became a kind of historical sticky note, a short and simple tale everyone could grab onto, whether or not it was true. It's a reminder that sometimes myths win the popularity contest over reality. We want villains we can boo and stories we can repeat at dinner parties, even if those stories are layered in fiction. So next time you hear that famous line, picture Marie not as a heartless dessert enthusiast, but as a woman swept up in a revolution of rumors. The cake, it turns out, is just the icing on a century's worth of misunderstanding. In the grand bakery of history, sometimes the best-known stories are half-baked, and the truth gets lost somewhere between the layers. If you'd like further adjustments to match an even more specific tone, length, or rhetorical balance, humor, seriousness, historical detail, just let me know. Today you're sizing up your boss, wondering if that ruthless Napoleon complex is historically accurate. Did France's most famous hat wearer really need a booster seat? Or was he just the victim of a translation error and some very petty British cartoons? Let's start with the basics. How tall was Napoleon really? When he died in 1821, Napoleon's height was recorded as 5 feet 2 inches. But before you picture a French garden gnome marshalling armies across Europe, pause for a second. That 5'2" was measured in French feet, which, in a twist worthy of a sitcom, are larger than their British counterparts. In modern measurements, Napoleon likely stood about 5 feet 6 or 5 feet 7 inches tall, absolutely average for his time, and incidentally, just a hair below today's global average for men. In other words, if Napoleon had shown up at your 19th century dinner party, his head would have fit just fine in the group photo. The myth of the minuscule emperor, however, thrives to this day. Why? Enter stage left. British propaganda. During and after the Napoleonic Wars, British cartoonists, armed with ink and a gleefully malicious sense of humour, set about caricaturing Napoleon as a diminutive tyrant with an outsized ego. His power-hungry posturing, paired with his hand-in-waistcoat signature pose, was fodder for generations of cartoons. If Instagram memes had existed in the 1800s, you can bet Napoleon's tiny temper would have trended for weeks. This ribbing was as much about deflating his military prowess as it was about skewering his personality. Meanwhile, the so-called Napoleon complex, the idea that shorter people overcompensate with aggressive behavior, was born, retroactively stapled to Napoleon's legacy. It didn't help that Napoleon surrounded himself with exceptionally tall guards. Against these hulking grenadiers, even a perfectly average man might look vertically challenged. Imagine being in the lineup at the NBA draft, and suddenly, your perfectly respectable 5'8" frame seems positively pocket-sized. But history's not so easily reduced to snappy internet insults. Peel away the layers of snark and spoof, and you discover an emperor who was, if anything, above average. Not in height, but ambition. Napoleon's rise from Corsican outsider to emperor of half of Europe was the work of someone who saw limitations as dares to be overcome, not causes for insecurity. Where did the real Napoleon's confidence come from? Was he compensating for lack of stature, or did a cunning strategist simply know how to project his authority? By most contemporary accounts, Napoleon had more than enough presence to fill a room, regardless of how many cartoonists tried to shrink him. Fast forward to today, and the Napoleon complex label is still thrown around, just as likely to be used in boardrooms, gyms, or debates among friends. But the real story is more complicated and perhaps more interesting. Napoleon wasn't particularly short for his era, and his legendary drive can't be neatly explained by a physical chip on his shoulder. If anything, What's truly noteworthy is how a smear campaign, served up with a side of punchy cartoons, rewrote history books and cemented a psychological term you still hear 2 centuries later. So, the next time someone drops a Napoleon joke in the break room, take a second to appreciate both the strange power of a good meme and the historical reality lurking beneath. Napoleon the man was not defined by his height, but by the size of his ambition and by the wit and spite of his rivals. Maybe he really was a full-strength emperor, not fun-sized after all, leaving us with a bigger story than most of us realize, no matter how you measure it. Congratulations, you're in the Middle Ages, and everyone supposedly thinks the Earth is flat. Can you sell them a globe? Are you at risk of falling off the edge, or just falling for a Renaissance-era rumour mill? The idea that medieval people broadly believed in a flat Earth is a persistent myth that somehow still shows up in history books and cartoons. But here's the plot twist. For most well-educated Europeans in the Middle Ages, the notion of a flat Earth was about as believable as unicorns hosting jousting tournaments. You wouldn't get very far hawking flat maps. In fact, if you showed up at a medieval university with your Earth as a pancake pitch, you'd likely be laughed out of the lecture hall or hit with an erudite reference to Aristotle. Where did the myth come from? Much of it traces back to Victorian-era writers looking for a way to show how enlightened their age had become, and how amusingly ignorant their ancestors were. Writers like Washington Irving, yes, the author of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, painted a picture of Columbus bravely sailing off to prove the world was round, dodging warnings from flat earth-fearing colleagues. It's a dramatic narrative, full of stormy seas and ominous horizons, but not exactly based on reality. Medieval scholars, from monks in cloisters to university masters, were actually quite aware of the Earth's roundness. In fact, if you'd asked Thomas Aquinas, Albertus Magnus, or even Dante, they'd have told you the Earth was a sphere and probably quoted Aristotle as backup. Classical knowledge survived the Dark Ages more robustly than we give it credit for. Ancient Greek thinkers like Pythagoras, Aristotle, and Eratosthenes, who even measured the Earth's circumference with sticks and shadows, take that GPS, had already established the Earth's roundness centuries before. Medieval authors inherited these works and didn't just copy them, they taught them. Textbooks like the 13th century Sphere by Johannes de Sacrobosco were staple material across European classrooms. Picture students in Paris or Oxford hunched over their manuscripts memorizing how the Earth casts a round shadow on the moon during a lunar eclipse. Not exactly the behaviour of a flat Earth society. So, why do we keep hearing about medieval flat earthers? Partly, it's because it's a great story, a tale of progress, of ignorance bested by reason. But it's also a misunderstanding. Medieval maps such as the famous T and O maps weren't attempts to chart flat planet geography. They were symbolic, emphasizing religious or philosophical points, not physical geography. To modernize, they look quaint at best, wildly inaccurate at worst. But to medieval scholars, these maps were practical tools for a worldview shaped as much by theology as navigation. Of course, outside scholarly circles, there were always individuals with eccentric beliefs, a few holdout literalists, or curious thinkers who took biblical metaphors a little too literally. But they were the exception, not the rule, and they were usually sidelined rather than celebrated. In reality, most educated medieval Europeans navigated by the stars, tracked lunar eclipses, and could even argue the finer points of planetary spheres, all without a whiff of panic about sailing over the edge. Mariners understood that ships disappear hull first over the horizon because the sea is curved. Late medieval textbooks used this very observation as proof of a round Earth. In the end, The myth of universal medieval flat earth belief says more about later generations' desire to feel superior than it does about medieval minds themselves. So, if you're peddling globes in the Middle Ages, the good news is you'll probably find some discerning customers. Just maybe skip the, "I bet you think the earth is flat" sales pitch. They might school you in science, a millennium ahead of schedule. Let me know if you'd like further tweaks, historical details, or adaptation to your preferred voice. Somewhere, a relative smugly claims Einstein failed math in school. This is your gentle reminder. Reality checks are more important than standardized tests. Let's unearth the truth about the world's favorite wild-haired genius and his report card. Let's set the record straight. Einstein did not fail math. In fact, he mastered advanced mathematics long before his peers were even assigned it. The infamous myth that Einstein struggled with basic arithmetic is one of those oddly compelling urban legends. Maybe it makes the rest of us feel better about our own homework traumas. But if you consult Einstein's own words, he wrote, "I never failed in mathematics. Before I was 15, I had mastered differential and integral calculus. Not exactly the resume of a math flunky." So, how did such a misconception take root? Blame it on a mix of mistranslation and a hunger for easy narratives. In the Swiss education system, grading was reversed at the time. Einstein scored top marks, but because the grading scale ran counter to what many are used to, it looked like he was bottom of the class. Picture this. An A in Einstein's report card was shown as a 1 instead of a 6, which would seem like an F to someone used to a different system. Cue generations of confusion. But if Einstein was mathematically gifted, where did this idea of chaos come from? The answer lies in his relationship to mathematics itself. He was obsessed not with rote number crunching, but rather with the elegant, underlying logic that math could reveal about the universe. To Einstein, mathematics was not a rigid discipline, but a language, one as expressive as poetry or music. His imagination often took him further than established mathematics could describe at the time, prompting him to seek collaborations with mathematicians who could help him articulate his breathtaking visions. When developing his general theory of relativity, Einstein famously grappled with complex tensor calculus, an area of math only a handful of experts understood. He spent years wading through equations. In correspondence with fellow physicist Michel Besseau, he lamented, "This business is by no means easy in my case." Some may have interpreted this as a struggle with math itself, but in truth, it was evidence of Einstein pushing up against the very edge of human knowledge. He wasn't lost in chaos. He was pioneering new mathematical territory. It's also worth mentioning that Einstein's approach to mathematics was surprisingly freewheeling. He saw no shame in abandoning brute calculation for creative problem solving. He preferred thought experiments, imagining himself riding alongside a beam of light, for example, over blindly following the mathematical methods set before him. Sometimes this led him to missteps. His mathematical training, while strong, was not as purely focused as the era's best mathematicians. That's why, during the formulation of general relativity, he leaned heavily on his friend Marcel Grossmann, a math prodigy who guided him through the necessary geometry. This partnership highlights one of Einstein's lesser-known superpowers, the humility to seek help when he was out of his depth. Critics may call this chaotic, but is it really? Perhaps. But it's precisely this willingness to embrace an uncertainty and collaborate, and to see mathematics not as a cage, but as a key, that fueled Einstein's most revolutionary ideas. The supposed chaos was, in fact, a laboratory for genius. He juggled mathematics like a circus performer, not always perfectly, but with absolute inventiveness. In the end, Einstein reminds us that mathematics is not just about getting the sums right. It's about envisioning the invisible and daring to ask impossible questions. Was his math absolute genius or absolute chaos? Maybe it was both, and maybe that's exactly what changed the world. You wake up in the crew's quarters, seasick and sweating. Land. But wait, who got here first? Let's unpack why history credits one guy's questionable navigation skills over millennia of well-traveled continents. First, let's set the stage. The Atlantic in 1492 wasn't some empty, flat rectangle. It was a corridor, pulsing with winds, wildlife, and above all, history. While Columbus and his crew stumbled thirsty onto unfamiliar shores, they weren't the first. Far from it. Long before any Spanish galleon cut across the waves, people had set foot on the Americas for thousands of years. From the ancestors of modern Native Americans following mammoth herds across the Bering Land Bridge, to the Norse sailors like Leif Erikson, who swapped sagas for supplies on what is now Newfoundland, the continent was discovered, settled, and known many times over. So how did a single Genoese sailor, with more confidence than maps, wind up with all the credit? The answer, as always, lies as much in storytelling as in sails. Columbus's 1492 landing wasn't history's first contact, just the most loudly advertised. European monarchs, hungry for new land and trade, needed a hero. Columbus was mythologized, his voyages expanding with every retelling. His long letters to the Spanish court described riches, Indians, and fabulous lands, tailored for an audience that wanted to believe they were at the center of a new world order. Meanwhile, tales of the Norse faded into myth. Written in dusty sagas, nobody in 16th century Spain was actually reading. And then, there's the uncomfortable question: what did discovery even mean? The indigenous peoples had vibrant, complex civilizations long before Columbus's ships scraped Caribbean sand. From the Iroquois Confederacy, negotiating treaties and cultivating crops, to the Maya, constructing pyramids and calendars, these societies were far from undiscovered. Yet history loves simple stories. In the European imagination, the map of the world had blank spots. Columbus, it seemed, filled them in for the global powers of the day. The erasure was not accidental, it was convenient. Let's pry into that a little more. Many ancient sources, from Chinese sailors to West African explorers, might have visited the Americas, or at least heard tales that traveled across oceans and deserts. But those stories never made it into the international press circuit of the day. It took European printing presses, powerful monarchies, and a thirst for imperial expansion to write Columbus into the center of the plot. His name was easy to say, easy to remember, perfect for school textbooks, if not for actual history. But why does this story persist? Because it works. Columbus fits the narrative arc. An underdog outsider, battling the odds, rewriting his place in the world. The familiar drama of overcoming the unknown and claiming land resonates, even if it whitewashes the reality of violence, misunderstanding, and exploitation that followed. The myth of discovery also sidesteps the far trickier, messier story of indigenous America, a tapestry of languages, cities, and cultures already there for anyone willing to look beyond the legend. The irony? Even Columbus didn't know where he had landed. He died thinking he had skirted the edge of Asia, not realizing he'd helped redraw the very idea of the world. Meanwhile, the lands he stumbled into would bear the name America, for another mapmaker entirely. So next time you're told Columbus discovered America, pause. Consider the millennia of footsteps, stories, and societies that came before. Discovery, after all, isn't just about landing somewhere new. It's about whose story gets told and who's left out of the narrative. The real voyage is teasing out the truth from the myth and giving every traveller their due, no matter which side of the ocean they called home. Legend has it that Europeans thought tomatoes were poison. Grab your non-stick pan and a side of superstition, because tonight's special is historical confusion, served cold. But what led to this juicy misconception? Let's step back to a candlelit medieval kitchen when most of Europe's menu was dominated by earthy root vegetables, gamey meats, and sour black bread. Enter the arrival of the tomato, a plump, glossy, scarlet fruit ferried from the New World in the 16th century. Exotic? Absolutely. Delicious? Potentially terrifying? Apparently yes. Here's where things get saucy. Tomatoes belong to the nightshade family, a plant group that, let's be honest, has a PR problem. Nightshades include beauties like deadly belladonna and toxic mandrake. So, when villagers saw tomatoes waltz into their gardens, decked out in the flashy colours of forbidden fruits, they raised a collective eyebrow. After all, if a plant's cousin can put you 6 feet under, do you really want its fruit on your pizza? Medieval logic. Better paranoid than poisoned. But superstition alone didn't write tomatoes off the medieval menu. The real culprit was a perfect storm of science and circumstance. Pewter plates, the medieval kitchen's favourite dinnerware, were loaded with lead. Tomatoes are highly acidic, and when placed on those pewter plates, their juices leach the lead out, turning a hearty meal into a chemistry experiment. Diners who indulged in tomato dishes sometimes fell ill while others died. Cue the whispers. It must be the fruit. Science took a back seat as urban legends sped ahead. This fear wasn't just kitchen gossip. It blossomed into a full-blown culinary Cold War. For almost 2 centuries, tomatoes grew as ornamental plants, seen, not eaten. People admired the lush vines and ripe fruit, but only the boldest, or most reckless, would actually take a bite. Like a medieval reality show, rumours spread. Tomatoes were only for the poor, or they were the favoured tool of poisoners. Either way, nobles and townsfolk alike kept their distance. The tomato became the medieval world's edible pariah. It wasn't until the 18th century that the tide turned. A handful of daring cooks and scientists challenged the poison apple propaganda. Italian chefs, ever the rebels, tossed tomatoes into their sauces and survived. Proving once again that progress often comes with a side of pasta. Across Europe, trial, error, and a hefty dose of skepticism eventually cleared the tomato's stained reputation. So was the fear entirely baseless? Not exactly. Another layer, botanical confusion. Tomatoes closely resemble other poisonous nightshades, and early botanical texts warned against eating the wrong berry. And don't forget the power of rumour. Byword alone can turn dinner into danger. Today, of course, tomatoes star in everything from ketchup to caprese salads. But that old superstition lingers, a reminder of how easily misinformation can spread when science and fear cook up something together. If you ever find yourself raising an eyebrow at a new food fad or warning, remember the tomato's tale. It's proof that sometimes the most dangerous thing in your kitchen isn't the food, it's what you believe about it. So, next time you sauce at paibe, a pizza, or spear a cherry tomato in your salad, give a silent thanks for the skeptics, the chefs, and even the poor medieval folks with their leaden plates. They paved the way for the plump, summery flavour we take for granted. And if you hear a friend claim tomatoes were once considered poisonous, you can set the record straight. Just don't serve it with a side of pewter. Salem, 1692. Witch hysteria at its peak. But did they really like the pyres? Or is that less fact and more Hollywood special effect? To set the scene, Imagine small-town New England blanketed by suspicion. Neighbors eye each other warily. Girls convulse in the pews, and sermons thunder with warnings of the devil's work. It sounds tailor-made for a blockbuster, right down to flaming stakes piercing the night sky. But here's the spoiler. In Salem, nobody was burned at the stake. Plot twist. Despite what films, Halloween decor, and pop culture would have you believe, the real story is less inferno, more noose. So, what actually went down in that paranoia-fueled year? The wave of accusations started in the tight confines of Reverend Parris's kitchen, with a handful of girls suddenly stricken by mysterious fits. In a society obsessed with rooting out sin, hysteria spread faster than gossip at the local tavern. Accusations multiplied, turning the town into a cauldron of fear. Soon, more than 200 people were accused of consorting with Satan. But here's where we have to pause and burst the pyro myth. The historical record is crystal clear. None of the 19 executed were burned at the stake. English law, which the colonies followed, reserved burning for only a few rare crimes, typically not witchcraft, and rarely in North America. Instead, Salem's convicted witches were hanged, dropped from ladders or carts, swinging over Proctor's Ledge, rather than set ablaze for a jeering crowd. The only victim of a truly grisly death was Giles Corey, who, refusing to enter a plea, was pressed to death under heavy stones. A far cry from the flames that so often flicker in our collective imagination. Why then does the image of the blazing pyre sear itself onto our screens and into our Halloween lore? Blame a combo of artistic license, transatlantic mix-ups, and a dash of drama. In Europe, yes, suspected witches, especially in places like Germany, France, and Scotland, were frequently condemned to death by fire. These stories, and some truly theatrical woodcut prints, crossed the Atlantic as fast as ship travel allowed. By the time Hollywood got involved, fire was just good visuals. Fire crackles, cackles, and looks great on camera. Also, let's be honest, stakes and flames make for a more lurid narrative than the bleak gallows behind Meeting House Hill. Still, Salem's tragedy didn't lack terror. The spectral evidence, a fancy term for dream reports and apparitions, became admissible in court. Friends accused friends. Children testified against parents. The fabric of a once close village disintegrated almost overnight. Trials became performance, fueled by mass panic, religious zeal, and a dash of local politics. Then, as abruptly as it began, the hysteria sputtered out. Ministers and officials started to question the chaos they'd unleashed, and the governor finally put a halt to the executions. So let's wrap up. The Salem witch trials serve as an enduring cautionary tale about groupthink, scapegoating, and the dangerous sway of unchecked fear. But if you're picturing villagers waving torches at blazing stakes, imagine instead the somber creak of ropes, the cold calculation of the gallows, and a community struggling to wake from a self-inflicted nightmare. In the end, Salem's fires burned only in rumour and in later retellings, evidence of how easily myth can overshadow messy, tragic history. The truth, as always, isn't quite as flashy, but it's far more haunting. You're in the Colosseum, clutching stale bread. The emperor gives a dramatic thumbs down. Is this really a death sentence, or is everyone just misreading the hand gestures? Popular culture has largely settled the debate. In movies, TV shows, and comic books, the thumb-down verdict is as reliably lethal as the roar of the crowd. Our collective imagination, thanks Ridley Scott, holds the scene. The vanquished gladiator sprawled on the sand, the emperor extending his thumb, and the crowd holding its breath for the final, chilling gesture. But how did we get here? Did the ancient Romans actually use thumbs up for mercy and thumbs down for death? It turns out the truth is a little more upside down. There's no shortage of excitement in Roman history, but actual descriptions of these gestures, pollice verso, are surprisingly vague. In Latin, pollice verso just means with turned thumb. But which direction? The sources don't exactly say. The 19th century painting by Jean-Léon Gérôme, grandly titled Pollice verso, shows the emperor giving the famous thumbs down. And this image, more than any dusty old scroll, set the stage for what we think we know. So what gesture did the Romans actually use? Some evidence suggests it was the opposite of what we see on screen. A thumb turned upward, possibly thrust straight out or even stabbing downward, meant death. Meanwhile, tucking your thumb into your fist, a gesture called pollice compresso, signaled mercy. Imagine the nerves of a gladiator. You'd want to see a hidden thumb, not a proud, stabbing one. Ancient eyewitnesses like the poet Juvenal and the historian Suetonius describe the infectious enthusiasm and gory demands of Roman spectators, but they're irritatingly coy about the details. The Roman historian Suetonius mentions pressed thumbs when talking about crowd reactions, and the poet Juvenal uses the phrase to turn the thumb as a sign of disfavour. But no one pens a clear thumbs up means X, thumbs down means Y chart. That ambiguity left wide open spaces for later writers and artists to invent meanings to suit their drama. Art filled in where texts left off. Gérôme's painting, and its wild success in the Victorian era, fed directly into early Hollywood. Cecil B. DeMille's The Sign of the Cross and Ridley Scott's Gladiator drew straight from Gérôme's colourfully imagined version. So, every time Russell Crowe glowers at the Emperor waiting for his fate, you're seeing not a moment scripted by actual Romans, but by a French painter 1,800 years later. But why do the thumbs matter so much? Maybe it's because the idea packs so much into one visual moment. Absolute power, life and death, decided in a second, the collective will of Rome in a single finger. The simplicity is irresistible and, ironically, oversimplifies the real complexity of Roman spectacle. Of course, Roman spectators loved drama. Senators and plebs alike flocked to bloodier and bloodier spectacles. Criminals mauled by wild animals, staged mythological executions, and, of course, gladiatorial duels. Did those in the stands all secretly know some intricate thumb code, a kind of gruesome sign language? Researchers think not. Most likely, the fate of a gladiator was usually decided in advance, with gestures used for show, more for the audience than for the doomed. In the end, the gladiator's fate was part theatre, part politics, and part crowd psychology. Hand gestures were only one piece of a bigger spectacle, a way to choreograph public feelings of mercy or bloodlust. The real thumbs up or down moment is far messier, blurred by time and imagination. So next time you see an emperor's thumb swing in the flickering light of the Colosseum, remember, history isn't always as clear-cut as a Hollywood close-up. The stale bread in your hand? At least you know more than most of the crowd did about what's really going on beneath those imperial digits. Soap and science rarely mix this well. Let's talk about the most dramatic bath time inspiration in history, and why the only thing Archimedes really invented was an excuse to run naked through town. Picture the scene. Syracuse, 3rd century BCE. The sun is blazing over marble colonnades. Inside a modest villa, an elderly mathematician, famous for muttering to himself and drawing cryptic symbols in the sand, finally leans back after a long day and sinks into a hot bath. Archimedes, trusted advisor to King Hiero, is not relaxing. His brain, like a nervous squirrel, never quite settles. The warm water rises around him, and suddenly, the weight of a kingdom's dilemma floats to the surface. The problem was no joke. King Hiero, paranoid about being cheated, had ordered a new golden crown. But when the crown arrived, it looked right, but suspicion stuck. Was it solid gold, or had the sneaky goldsmith swapped out the precious metal for cheap silver? There was no way to break the crown open without destroying it. The king needed a loophole, a clever, bloodless way to sniff out fraud. Enter the bath. As Archimedes lowered himself into the tub, he watched the water slosh and spill over the edge. The level of the water rose. But why? In a rare flash of scientific slapstick, the answer crashed over him. Any object submerged in a fluid is buoyed up by a force equal to the weight of the fluid it displaces. Lesson learned. Bath time is never just bath time for a mind that never lets go. Visions of gold crowns and sneaky cheats fizzled in the steam. Suddenly, physics was more relevant than soap. And so begins the legend, the sudden insight, erupting into a slapstick streak down the streets of Syracuse. Cloak abandoned, dignity in tatters. Archimedes sprints out of his house, shrieking, "Eureka! Eureka!" Greek for, "I have found it," with a wildness that only a true nerd faced with destiny can muster. Neighbours draw their curtains. The kids on the street get a story for life. Somewhere, King Hiero probably wished he'd just bought the cheaper crown and saved the city the spectacle. But let's clear the fogged-up mirror here. Did it really happen like this? Or have centuries of repetition washed away the more mundane details, leaving behind a sudsy myth? Most historians today agree the core of the story is plausible. The principle Archimedes discovered, now called Archimedes' principle, is foundational to physics and engineering. But was there an actual naked jog? Did he leap out mid-bubble bath? Or was it merely the image, not the act, that stuck? The lines between fact and fable blur around the edges, as they do with all the best science stories. What matters more than streaking, though, is the enduring model Archimedes gave to all future scientists. A mind ready to see the extraordinary in the ordinary, to notice what everyone else overlooks. His messy, unfiltered excitement set the template for every future eureka moment, from Newton's apple to Fleming's mouldy bread. Archimedes' bath wasn't just about water and gold. It was about learning to recognize inspiration in life's most unglamorous corners. And let's be honest, nobody commemorates the scientists who calmly finished their baths, toweled off, and then wrote a polite letter to the king. Archimedes gave us a formula, for sure, but more importantly, he gave generations of thinkers permission to get unreasonably excited by their own ideas, and to understand that the greatest discoveries often start as questions bubbling up at the oddest times, usually when the soap is already in your eyes. So next time your best idea comes to you in the shower, remember Archimedes, and maybe, just maybe, keep the towel handy. You grab a broomstick for sweeping, not flying. Are you safe from witch accusations? Turns out, most alleged witches were far less hocus pocus and far more wrong place, wrong century. Medieval and early modern witch hunting was less about women cackling over bubbling cauldrons and more about communities venting their fears. If you think you're exempt, imagine this. It's 1630. You've got a suspiciously thriving herb garden, and last week your neighbour's cow dropped dead. Congratulations, you're the new star of Everyone's Out to Get You. Witch accusations often targeted people who seemed a little different. Read, eccentric, elderly, or simply unlucky enough to live alone at the edge of a village. There were no Hogwarts letters, just finger-pointing, wild allegations, and the local magistrate eyeing you with a frown. Pop culture has painted witches as glamorous rebels with pointy hats and sassy cats, but reality was much duller and quite a bit sadder. The so-called witches weren't shape-shifting, power-wielding fantasy figures. They were usually poor, marginalized, or just considered oddballs by their neighbors. Sometimes, all it took was a spat over property lines or a burned pie to get the cauldron bubbling. The targets: widows who lived alone, healers with herbal know-how, people whose family histories had more misfortune than most. So, what kicked off all this broom-waving panic? The roots run deep. Crowded villages, failing harvests, and disease outbreaks made 16th and 17th century Europeans keen to find a scapegoat. Enter the witch. Accusing someone was a way to explain away the unexplainable. Got a bad storm? Crops won't grow? Someone's child falls suddenly ill? Witchcraft became the medieval version of turn it off and on again, the go-to troubleshooting method for anything weird. If you're picturing grand courtroom showdowns with cackling old ladies, hold that thought. Most witch trials were messy, inconsistent, and terrifying. Some regions saw official inquisitors and torture chambers, while others just had townsfolk with a list of grudges and a love for gossip. Accused witches faced tests that even the best escape room can't match: floating in water to prove innocence. If you sank, too bad. If you floated, you were deemed a witch. Or having to recite prayers backward while everyone stared. Spoiler: the odds were not in your favour. Gender played a massive role, but men could be swept up too. Looking at you, Salem. Still, most of the accused were women. Why? Historical scholars point to simmering anxieties about women's sexuality, property rights, and social independence. If you talked a bit too much, healed someone with herbs, or simply aged past childbearing years, you ran a higher risk of becoming neighborhood enemy number one. Behind the witch mask, we find deeper questions. Who has power in society? Who gets to decide what's normal? Witch hunting eventually fizzled as science crept in, and legal reforms made it tougher to prosecute magical crimes. Newspapers, pamphlets, and good old skepticism chipped away at the idea that the neighbour's headache or the spoiled milk must be the result of sorcery. Today, witches have been reclaimed in popular culture as symbols of independence, rebellion, and yes, style. Pointy hats remain stubbornly fashionable. So, next time you reach for a broom or stir something mysterious in your kitchen, take comfort. Witch hunting era justice usually had more to do with community panic and less with spellbooks or midnight flights. There were no real flying lessons required, just a surplus of suspicion and a shortage of modern science. If witch simply meant outsider, maybe we should all wear our pointy hats with a bit more pride. Rampaging through villages, or politely asking to borrow some sugar. The truth about Viking raids might surprise you and disappoint your action movie expectations. If all you know of Vikings comes from TV shows where everyone's personal hygiene is optional and every problem is solved with an axe, you're in for a twist. Sure, the Vikings have a rap sheet that seems longer than a Nordic winter, coastal raids, pillaging monasteries, and a body count that makes for great cinematic bloodbaths. But real life? It was a lot more complicated, and dare we say, more than a little bit mundane. So, let's start with what we do know. Yes, the Vikings did arrive in their iconic longships, and yes, those ships were occasionally filled to the brim with burly Scandinavians, shields in hand, beards in full glory. The monasteries of Lindisfarne, for example, would probably agree with the stereotype. The 793 raid there. That really did happen, and it was enough to send chroniclers' quills trembling in terror all across medieval Europe from why. But here's where things stop being so simple. For every bloody raid that gets recounted in trembling Latin by a terrified monk, there are dozens of Viking encounters that didn't end in chaos. In fact, the Vikings were just as likely to show up to talk business, quite literally offering deals instead of demands. Archaeological discoveries paint a picture of Norsemen trading fur, amber, and swords for silk, wine, and silver. Contracts, not carnage, sustained their adventures more often than battlefields. Why the difference? It's all about perspective. To the English monks, anyone arriving in a dragon-headed ship looked like the villain in their worst nightmares, regardless of the newcomer's actual intentions. The fear was real, but reality was messier. Yes, sometimes the Vikings raided, but sometimes the terrifying invaders had just come to swap gossip, stories, and maybe pick up some new tableware. If you were living in a sleepy riverside village, Viking ships gliding upriver would definitely jolt you awake, but you wouldn't always end up running for your life. Dig a little deeper and you'll notice something else. The distinction between raiding and trading was often pretty fuzzy. Vikings might arrive as peaceful merchants one season, then come back the next year with less chill intentions, or vice versa. Sometimes the threat of violence was just a negotiation tactic. Lovely monastery you've got here. Be a shame if we, raided it. In some cases, local leaders paid Danegeld, protection money, to avoid actual conflict, which made for a much less exciting story than a clashing battle axes montage. So, were the Vikings bloodthirsty or just easily annoyed? Perhaps a bit of both. Life in Scandinavia wasn't exactly a picnic. Rocky soil, long winters, and not much in the way of Netflix. Viking society was tough, but not mindlessly cruel. Raiding was a way to get ahead in a world that offered few chances, but so was conducting shrewd business, marrying into local families, and frankly, setting up shop rather than burning everything in sight. Many Vikings who left home never returned, instead merging with local communities from Russia to Ireland. Modern historians now warn us not to take medieval propaganda at face value. Much of what we think we know about the Vikings comes from their terrified victims or later storytellers who thrived on drama. To the people they encountered, Vikings could be the literal worst, or, surprisingly, fine dinner guests. So, next time you think of Vikings rampaging through villages, remember, they may have been feared for their violence, but they were equally skilled at being adaptable, ambitious, and, when it suited them, remarkably civil. Sometimes history's greatest villains were just very annoyed by not being invited to the party, and sometimes they brought the cake, sand, linen, and coal. But was Cleopatra really the olive-skinned goddess of legend? Or did Roman gossip just go viral 2,000 years too early? To understand how Cleopatra's image became iconic, picture ancient Alexandria, a swirl of ethnicities, trade, and intrigue. Cleopatra herself was a patchwork of influences, Greek by blood, Egyptian by throne, and Mediterranean in upbringing. Yet over time, her looks became a canvas onto which generations projected their own ideas of beauty, mystery, and power. In the popular imagination, she's morphed from a cunning strategist and polyglot ruler to a glamour icon complete with winged eyeliner and serpentine accessories. But how accurate is the image we all have of Cleopatra today? The Romans, masters of propaganda, were quick to circulate stories about her supposed exoticism. They amplified tales of her lavish costumes, seductive makeup, and even her otherness. To them, her kohl-rimmed eyes and rich gowns weren't just style choices, but evidence of a civilization both wondrous and threatening, distant, yet tantalizingly close. It was a convenient way to turn an enemy into a spectacle, and a subtle justification for their own conquest. Roman writers like Cassius Dio and Plutarch couldn't resist spicing things up, describing Cleopatra's dramatic entrances and otherworldly appeal. she became less a politician and more a character in a grisly tabloid. Even coins from her era, which show a strong, aquiline profile, were overshadowed by later images dripping with Orientalist fantasies. The Romans relished depicting her as dangerously attractive, using her looks to explain her political prowess, as if intelligence and charisma alone couldn't possibly account for her influence on Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Fast forward centuries, and the legend only grew glossier. Hollywood, of course, embraced Cleopatra as the original femme fatale. First Theda Bara in 1917, then Claudette Colbert, and most famously, Elizabeth Taylor in 1963. All swanned on screen in dazzling costumes, golden headpieces, and that unmissable, dramatic eye makeup. Each adaptation added layers of allure, blending pharaoh chic with whatever was the fashion of the era. Here, the exotic Cleopatra was less about accuracy and more about escapist fantasy, glamour with a heavy dose of mystique. These silver screen interpretations cemented Cleopatra's looks in the modern psyche. Skin glowing like desert sun, regal yet enigmatic. Historians now actively debate what Cleopatra really looked like. Ancient coins and sculptures provide the few reliable clues, suggesting a ruler valued for her intellect and presence rather than model-perfect features. Scholars remind us that beauty ideals then differed greatly from today's. Still, one thing's clear. The real Cleopatra carefully crafted her image, blending Egyptian and Greek symbols to connect with her diverse subjects. She used cosmetics strategically, as much to command respect in the council chamber as to impress in a banquet hall. But why does it matter whether we get Cleopatra's looks right? It's about more than pedantic accuracy. Her enduring exoticism says as much about who we are now as who she was then. When histories filter smudges, facts into fable, real women risk being flattened into cartoons, flattened by those in power and by those who profit from the mythos. The real Cleopatra was a strategist, multilingual, ambitious, pragmatic, and relentless. Glamour was a powerful tool in her arsenal, but never her only weapon. So the next time you picture Cleopatra, bathed in moonlight or traversing marble halls, pause for a second. Peel back the layers of narrative, coal, the Hollywood gold leaf, and even the Roman aspersions. What remains is a woman who understood the power of appearance in both politics and pop culture. A queen who knew how to use history's glam filter as well as any influencer today. And as with any great ruler, it's the story behind the image that remains the most captivating. Newton, an apple tree, gravity, a slapstick classic. But did the apple really fall as neatly as your schoolbook illustration suggests? Let's pause. The mental image is universally absurd. Isaac Newton lounging idly under the summer shade, lost in thought, only to be suddenly accosted by a rebellious apple. Maybe it bounced off his head. Maybe it thudded reassuringly beside him in the grass. Or maybe, sacrilege, it never actually happened. The truth, as is often the case, is a tangled orchard of legend, ego, and historical retelling. A tale that grew juicier, and perhaps a little more dramatic, with every telling. The 17th century was not a time of Instagrammed moments or viral videos. If Newton did post about an apple, it likely would have involved sending a 1,000-word letter to the Royal Society and patiently awaiting his likes 6 months later. Still, the apple has become a symbol, a story that grounds an abstract idea, universal gravitation, in something everyone can imagine, a falling fruit, an inspired observer. But behind the legend lies the real Newton, eccentric, brilliant, notorious for working in obsessive, caffeinated isolation. His apple wasn't just a snack, it became an entry point to the physics of the universe. Here's what we actually know. Newton himself rarely mentioned the famous apple. It was his friend and first biographer, William Stukeley, who decades later wrote that Newton once reminisced about how watching an apple drop led him to ponder why things always fall straight down. Was it Earth's pull? Was the force the same that kept the moon circling above? Newton didn't leap up, shouting, "Eureka!" He mulled it over, as Newtons are wont to do, for years. The apple was a prompt for deep thinking, not slapstick inspiration. Nevertheless, there is something magical in the image. The apple makes Newton's discovery accessible, humble, even comic. Instead of a gaunt, intimidating scientist shrouded in candlelit calculation, we see a curious, sometimes bored human being, his mind drifting from the mundane to the profound. Gravitation, the force that orders galaxies and tumbles apples to the lawn, suddenly feels like a concept born in a garden picnic, not a distant laboratory. Let's also acknowledge, Newton was not struck by divine apple magic alone. Centuries of thinkers had noticed, quantified, and puzzled over falling objects. Galileo, who dropped balls from towers and rolled them down ramps, got there first, at least in terms of timing gravity's work. But Newton's true leap was in connecting dots, recognizing that the force pulling an apple earthward was the same cosmic glue holding the planets to their orbits. He did the math, painstakingly of course, and announced, in suitably dense prose, that gravity's reach is both local and universal. Now, is it more fun to imagine the apple bouncing off Newton's powdered wig, like a slapstick sound effect from an old cartoon? Absolutely. Stories need hooks. The apple is gravity's snack attack, a physical object in a physical world, reminding us that even groundbreaking inspiration is triggered by the everyday. Yet the value lies not in the fruit, but in the habit of noticing, a mind that asks why, when most would merely brush off the grass stains and look for dessert. So, whether you imagine a Newton lolling under trees or hunched in candlelit calculation, remember that genius is less about waiting for fruit to fall and more about paying attention, connecting the ordinary to the extraordinary. The apple was never magic. The magic was in the mind that realized a falling apple might answer questions about the moon. Gravity's snack attack, then, isn't about head injuries or moments of bumbling revelation. It's about the world nudging us, sometimes gently, sometimes with a thud, to think just a little bigger than before. So modest, Victorians supposedly dressed their table legs. Was this the height of prudery, or just an 1800s joke that got out of hand? The image is irresistible. Prim Victorian ladies scandalized by bare furniture, scurrying to shield table legs from corrupting the family morals. Victorian purity at its most absurd. But like so many irresistible stories, this one is wrapped in myth, period etiquette, and a surprising amount of tongue-in-cheek reporting. To understand how table legs in tights became shorthand for the era's prudishness, we have to peel back the lace and dust off some old, creaky truths. Let's start with the context. The Victorian era, stretching from 1837 to 1901, is now famous for its strict social codes and hyper-awareness of respectability. By the mid-1800s, conversations about sexuality were rigorously policed. Euphemism was everywhere. Arms were sometimes limbs, and even a lady's legs might be delicately described as lower extremities. The very word leg could raise an eyebrow in polite company. One wonders what Pilates classes would have been called. Into this world, the story arrives like a parlour joke. Victorian families so wary of impropriety that table legs, of all things, had to be covered, for fear that their naked contours would stir impure thoughts. Books, lectures, and even some early tourist accounts loved to poke fun at our prudish ancestors this way. Popular anecdotes claimed that not only tables, but also piano legs, and even pianos themselves, were dressed in miniature skirts. These stories persist, passed along in apocryphal histories and cartoons that paint Victorians as comically buttoned up. But what's the evidence? Here's where history wags its own finger. There's precious little contemporary record of Victorians actually losing sleep over sensuous furniture. Many historians believe the table leg modesty tale originated from satirical pieces in British and American magazines. Think the 19th century equivalent of online meme culture. Mark Twain, for instance, was fond of sending up British manners. Some of the earliest references to covering table legs as a moral necessity come from his work, where the absurdity is the punchline, not the practice. That's not to say the Victorians weren't obsessed with propriety. They most certainly were. Furniture was often draped, but this was usually for practical reasons: dust protection, fashion, and a love of ornate decoration. Lace antimacassars and heavy curtains weren't quarantine zones for libido. They were status symbols and housekeeping expedients. If a table was dressed, it probably had more to do with showing off new textiles than hiding risque curves. If anything, it's the Victorian ability to create myths about themselves that stands out most. The table leg story, real or not, reveals more about our fascination with the Victorian mind than their actual behaviour. It's a perfect symbol for what we love to believe about the period, that repression seeped into every detail, down to the household furniture. In an era when modern societies grapple with shifting boundaries of public decency, the story operates as both a warning and a joke, a reminder that every age has its own line between proper and preposterous. So next time you run into the Victorian table legs in tights anecdote, remember, it's probably a yarn, spun for a laugh or a wink about prudery gone wild. The real lesson isn't about offended sensibilities, but about how cultures, then and now, use stories to make sense of their own contradictions. And that, perhaps, is the most Victorian detail of all. Besides, it's hard to be too prudish when you invented the fainting couch, a furniture item whose main purpose was to enable dramatic swooning. Now that's commitment to a bit. Let me know if you want further tweaks or wish to integrate direct quotes or period sources. Are you drooling at the sound of a YouTube notification, or is that just classical conditioning? Maybe Pavlov's furry test subjects weren't the drool machines you've been led to believe. Let's rewind to late 19th century Russia, where Ivan Pavlov wasn't originally setting out to reprogram canine brains. He just wanted to know what happened in a dog's digestive system when they ate. But soon, something curious started happening in his lab. The dogs would start salivating before food even arrived, sometimes at the mere sound of a lab assistant's footsteps. Forget food bowls. These dogs seem to have a sixth sense for snack time. Pavlov, never one to ignore a good mystery, decided to get to the bottom of this scientifically. He conducted an ingenious series of experiments, pairing a neutral stimulus, like the ringing of a bell, with the arrival of food. It didn't take long before the bell alone had the dogs drooling like cartoon wolves at the sight of a juicy steak. There it was, a conditioned reflex, and boom, classical conditioning entered the psychology textbooks and eventually every high school science fair. But here's the twist. The bell wasn't Pavlov's only, or even his favourite instrument. Sometimes it was a metronome, a buzzer, or even the hum of a tuning fork. That image of a proper Russian scientist ringing a dainty little dinner bell for a line of eager pups. more myth than fact. Still, the principle remains. The dogs learn to associate an otherwise meaningless sound with the ultimate reward, turning the jangling of metal into the canine equivalent of an ice cream truck jingle. So, what does this have to do with your own modern-day behavior? You may not have floppy ears and a wet nose, okay, maybe after a workout, but like Pavlov's pups, you are absolutely wired to link everyday cues with emotional or physical responses. That quickening of your heartbeat when your phone buzzes, the almost physical urge to check your inbox when you hear a certain chime at work. Congratulations, you're living proof that classical conditioning isn't just for the animal kingdom. Let's dig a little deeper. Pavlov's critical insight was that much of learning, at least at first, happens at a subconscious level, beneath our supposedly rational decision-making. He showed that powerful automatic habits can be built from the ground up when repeated associations are formed. No deep thought required. This explains a lot about how habits, both good and bad, can sneak their way into your daily routine. Now think about the platforms and products you interact with every day. Notifications, alerts, and signature sounds are meticulously engineered to spark a reaction. Your attention, your clicks, maybe even your wallet. In other words, the tech world has gone full Pavlov, training us all to become drooling test subjects for their next big hit. Except, instead of treats, we chase likes, streams, or discounts. Who needs dog biscuits when you've got dopamine? Here's the kicker. While Pavlov's dogs eventually stopped salivating if the bell rang but food never arrived, a process called extinction, modern digital cues are endlessly variable and rewarding, making it far harder to break the cycle. It's like Pavlov constantly teasing the dogs with the promise of food, just often enough to keep them hoping. So next time you're tempted by a ping or flash, remember those 19th century dogs, and then remember you're a step ahead. You can spot the patterns, rewrite your routines, maybe even reclaim a little bit of freedom from all those digital dinner bells. Because in this grand experiment called life, it's worth asking, are you the dog or are you the scientist? If you'd like, I can adjust the balance of humor and depth, or add more concrete examples from technology or psychology. Let me know your preference. Did the father of his country really chew the scenery with a mouthful of kindling, or is this just dental folklore gone wild? Let's bite into the legend, shall we? The image of George Washington hacking away at a hunk of venison with splinters flying from his smile is practically stitched onto the American flag of tall tales. But as with all myths involving dead presidents and improbable dental scenarios, the true story is far more complex and perhaps even more fascinating than the version that gets passed around at children's history assemblies. Washington's dental drama is a living example of how a simple fact can get gussied up for dramatic effect until it morphs into a bit of national mythology. So where did this splintery rumor start? Washington absolutely suffered from notoriously bad teeth. By the time he was president, he'd lost most of his natural chompers, and the guy was still in his 40s. Pain, abscesses, swelling. He faced it all. Imagine trying to lead a nation while constantly holding a handkerchief discreetly to your jaw. Washington's struggle wasn't exactly top secret. His correspondence and diary entries are littered with mentions of lost teeth and unsuccessful attempts at pain relief. The prescribed remedies of the day, ranging from dubious elixirs to outright torture devices, probably did him no favors. It's here that myth and fact begin to tussle. Washington wore dentures all right, but brace yourself. Not a single pair was made from wood. In reality, his dental prosthetics were crafted from a motley assortment of materials, including ivory, gold, lead, and even real human teeth purchased from donors, ahem, whose willingness to give is up for debate. Some of his false teeth were made from hippopotamus ivory, a far cry from the humble oak or hickory most schoolchildren are led to envision. These dentures were held together by metal springs that apparently made eating and speaking such an ordeal that even Washington's famous composure was put to the test. So why the enduring story of wooden teeth? Chalk it up to a combination of wishful thinking and a bit of optical illusion. You see, over time, ivory dentures would become stained from wine, food, and tobacco, developing hairline cracks. To a casual observer or imaginative schoolchild, this might look suspiciously like wood grain. Add in a dash of historical telephone and suddenly, voila, Washington the termite bait is born. To his credit, George Washington endured these dental indignities with stoic determination. He was often seen clenching his mouth shut in portraits, a habit not born from sternness but mortification. His dentures didn't fit well and sometimes distorted his jaw, which only grew worse as he aged. If you look closely at those dignified oil paintings, you'll notice that the jowly face and pursed lips, so often imitated by actors, are the telltale signatures of a fellow bravely enduring a face full of 18th century orthodontics. Talk about suffering for your country. But Washington's oral woes weren't just a personal problem. They were also a national secret. Rumours about his poor health were political dynamite, and both he and his staff worked diligently to keep his dental situation under wraps. Handwritten letters to his dentist, John Greenwood, smuggled out of the White House with a secrecy usually reserved for state secrets, reveal a man desperately seeking relief. Greenwood's inventive, if sometimes horrifying, solutions, such as constructing spring-loaded dentures to improve chewing, were state-of-the-art at the time. In the end, perhaps the myth of the wooden teeth persists, not because it's true, but because it's a perfect metaphor for Washington himself. Enduring, solid, and yes, a little rough around the edges. For all his gravitas and precedent-setting statesmanship, our first president was also just a mortal man who suffered for that presidential smile. So, the next time you're at the dentist, spare a thought for George and be grateful you don't have to choose between ivory, gold, and, well, the family, silverware. And no, he never gnawed down a cherry tree with wooden teeth. That's a bite too far. Did one man in upstate New York invent baseball? Or is the story more tangled than your last attempt at assembling IKEA furniture without the instructions? Let's set the scene. It's the early 20th century, and a nation is hungry for a mythic origin story. Enter Abner Doubleday, Union General, Civil War hero, and, according to one particularly creative committee, baseball's very own Prometheus. The claim was simple, bold, and absurdly patriotic. Abner, in a flash of inspiration, invented baseball on a sunny afternoon in Cooperstown, New York, in 1839. No trial runs, no rough sketches on napkins, just pure Americana, fully formed. But let's ask the obvious question. If Abner Doubleday really invented baseball, why didn't he ever mention it? Not once in his journals, his letters, or in casual conversation did Doubleday say, "Oh, by the way, did I ever tell you about the time I invented America's national pastime?" You'd think that would come up at least once, especially in those long winter months when there's little else to brag about. So where did this civic myth come from? The roots trace back to the Mills Commission, an all-star team of baseball's early guard convened in 1905 and tasked with determining the game's origin once and for all. And how did they solve the riddle? By relying almost exclusively on the testimony of one man, Abner Graves, a mining engineer with a vivid imagination and a dubious relationship with hard evidence. Graves insisted he witnessed Doubleday's sketch, The First Diamond in the Dust. But his story read more like an epic bedtime tale than a notarized affidavit. Still, the tale stuck. Why? Because America loves a good creation myth, preferably involving small towns, small miracles, and the spirit of invention. and maybe a dash of military heroism for good measure. Besides, Cooperstown sounded like the sort of place baseball would be invented. Rolling green fields, a postcard-perfect main street, and enough nostalgia in the air to season an entire season of Ken Burns documentaries. Of course, baseball historians, never ones to leave a myth unchallenged, weren't content to let this legend stand untested. Look beyond Cooperstown, and you find bat and ball games with much older pedigrees. English rounders, anyone? How about town ball or base? Variations of the sport were already played in schoolyards and cow pastures across the young republic decades before Doubleday was even tall enough to swing a bat. Still, America embraced the Cooperstown myth. Maybe it's because it gave the sport a birthplace as tidy and tourist-friendly as a Norman Rockwell painting. Maybe it was just fun to have a hero. Or maybe, like that oddly shaped Allen wrench that comes with IKEA furniture, it's just easier to believe in something simple, even when the instructions are laughably incomplete. Over a century later, the Hall of Fame stands tall in Cooperstown, and little leaguers still make pilgrimages to its legendary diamond. Never mind that Doubleday's baseball credentials evaporate under scrutiny, or that Abner Graves's testimonial reads more as wishful thinking than legal deposition. The story persists, half folklore, half marketing, all irresistibly American. So, was baseball invented in Cooperstown? Or was the story just the nation's first great sporting conjob? Maybe both. After all, every legend has a bit of truth, and every truth deserves a good story. Just don't ask Abner Doubleday. He's got a war to fight and, apparently, an entire sport to invent in his spare time. If you need edits, subsections, or more direct references to your transcripts, let me know. Securing virtue with rusty metal underwear, a real trend, or just something museums made up to spice up their exhibits? Let's start with the classic image. A grim-faced, medieval father, clamping a cold, iron contraption onto his daughter before shipping her off to the castle. Sounds like the stuff of legends, or at least painfully awkward family dinners. Chastity belts, thanks to their depiction in pop culture and cartoons, occupy a strange place in our collective imagination. Are they a real remnant of a prudish era, or the Renaissance equivalent of an urban legend? For centuries, stories about chastity belts have been whispered with equal parts horror and skepticism. Supposedly invented to ensure knights had something worth fighting for on their return from the Crusades, these infamous devices allegedly protected a woman's chastity by locking it down, literally. Early museum displays, old illustrations, and even some literature have cemented the notion that chastity belts were widespread, almost standard medieval fare. But what's beneath the myth, aside from a lot of uncomfortable metal edges? First, let's talk evidence. Most so-called medieval chastity belts on display in museums today actually trace back to the 19th century, hundreds of years after they were supposedly used. When examined closely, these belts look suspiciously pristine for relics that would have seen daily wear and tear back in the Middle Ages. Some scholars have even jokingly called them Victorian fantasies, products of an era obsessed with both sexual repression and the weirdest possible novelties to show off to their friends. That skepticism is justified. Contemporary medieval sources are almost silent on the matter. Laws, diaries, medical manuals, you name it, make no real mention of widespread chastity belt usage. Where they do appear, it's usually in satirical poems, bawdy jokes, or, occasionally, moralizing artwork intended more to warn than to document reality. It's a bit like assuming everyone in the 21st century walks around with a banana phone just because it showed up in a meme. But if not medieval hardware, then what? The explosion of chastity belts in the Victorian period didn't come out of nowhere. As society grew ever more anxious about female sexuality and inventiveness in metalworking hit new heights, the idea of locking virtue away became an irresistible topic for both moralists and pranksters. Some belts from the 1800s were genuine anti-masturbation devices, born of the era's health hysteria rather than any romantic notions of knights and ladies. So why do we cling to this myth? Partly, it provides a darkly comic image of the past, one that makes modern society feel enlightened and progressive in comparison. There's also a certain perverse appeal to imagining an age so absurdly repressive that entire industries sprung up just to keep women clad in iron pants. Of course, the chastity belt legend isn't entirely groundless. There were isolated cases of locking devices, mostly for punishment, deterrence, or as a symbol in erotic literature. But the idea of them being a standard issue kit for every medieval maiden, that's history as told by the weirdest museum gift shop, not the real Middle Ages. More often than not, the true story behind chastity belts is less 50 Shades of Grey and more Victorian prank gone wild. In a way, chastity belts are a medieval Kickstarter, minus the stretch goals and delivery delays. Someone had the idea, a few prototypes existed, and then centuries later, people were still sharing the story. Except, in this case, nobody actually wanted to back the project. So next time you see a chastity belt nestled behind dusty glass, remember, it's more likely to be a conversation piece from a repressed Victorian parlour than the battle gear of a crusader's beloved. Metal undies, probably fiction, possibly a punchline, and definitely proof that history has an excellent sense of humour. Pass the cranberry sauce, but hold the myth-making. Was the first Thanksgiving a peaceful potluck, or just a highly edited highlight reel? Let's rewind to 1621, to Plymouth Colony, where a mismatched dinner guest list gathered around what would become the country's most famous and misunderstood meal. On one side, the Pilgrims, who had survived their first brutal winter, mostly thanks to indigenous knowledge and a tolerance for eating whatever didn't eat them first. On the other, the Wampanoag people, led by the Sachem Massasoit, whose agricultural savvy and a healthy dose of curiosity brought them to this iconic gathering. The Puritans may have said grace, but it was indigenous expertise that put actual food on the table. The menu? Let's just say neither pumpkin pie nor homemade stuffing were invited. History's appetizers included venison, courtesy of Wampanoag hunters, along with wild fowl, eels, corn, served as a porridge, not cornbread, and maybe even a few oysters. If you're picturing a butter-basted turkey perched majestically in the center, give your imagination a gold star for creativity. There probably was some bird, but turkey was a generic colonial word for many types of wild fowl, so it could just as easily have been duck, goose, or something unidentifiable, but feathered. So how did this multicultural meal of survival and necessity morph into today's mythic tableau featuring pilgrims in buckles and friendly hand turkey crafts? It's the result of centuries of storytelling, wishful thinking, and a dash of political seasoning. Early Thanksgivings were patchy, a day here or there, for harvest or gratitude, depending on the colony or the whim of the governor. It took Abraham Lincoln, in the midst of civil war, to declare Thanksgiving a national holiday in 1863, in hopes that a shared dinner might soothe a broken nation. By then, the story had shed all mention of hardships, squabbles, or the less than gracious realities of colonial Indian relations. And about those relations, the dinner itself was more détente than friendship. The Pilgrims needed allies, and the Wampanoag needed support against rival tribes. The so-called invitation may, in fact, have been an impromptu convergence. Hearing celebratory gunfire as the colonists wrapped up their harvest, Massasoit and 90 of his men showed up, possibly unannounced, expecting trouble, not Turkey. Talk about the world's first unplanned +90. It's unclear if everyone was thrilled about this expanded guest list, but in the spirit of crisis management, they muddled through with 3 days of shared eating, sporadic alliance building, and a plenty of mutual side-eye. If there was a spirit of gratitude, it was likely tempered by relief. Relief at surviving the year, at not poisoning one another, intentionally at least, and at making it through a multilingual, multicultural feast without anyone storming off before dessert. The stolen seats of this segment's title isn't just clever wordplay. Land, Wampanoag land, was already quietly being absorbed by the colonists through treaties, trade deals, and eventually, open seizure. Each Thanksgiving reenactment might gloss over this, but history lingers in the empty seats as much as the filled ones. As for the leftovers, we've inherited more than we admit. Thanksgiving is now a battleground of family law, kitchen meltdowns, and commercial enticement, as complicated and contentious as its origins. Today, we tell 2 stories, sometimes at the same table, one of unity across divides, and another, quieter one, about power, survival, and who gets a seat. So as you pass the gravy this year, take a moment to consider the resilience, not just of those who feasted, but of those whose presence often goes unmentioned. The first Thanksgiving wasn't just a meal. It was an uneasy truce, a momentary crossing of forks, and the beginning of a story we are still struggling to tell honestly. Psychics, magicians, and mildly disappointed cutlery. The real story behind history's shadiest party trick. Spoon bending. Just mention it at a dinner party and watch as guests either roll their eyes, fumble for their forks, or start humming the Twilight Zone theme. But for a few years in the 1970s, one man could turn a teaspoon into a career. Enter Uri Geller, a name now synonymous with twisted silverware, furrowed brows, and the kind of dramatic hand gestures usually reserved for Italian grandmothers or frantic air traffic controllers. Let's set the scene. London, 1973. The oil crisis is looming, corduroy is fashionable, and Uri Geller, an Israeli-born self-proclaimed psychic, walks onto the British talk show stage with a confidence that might, in certain circumstances, be mistaken for superpowers. He claims to be able to bend spoons, stop watches, and even read minds, all with the focused power of his mysterious mentalist abilities. Now, here's the thing about spoon bending. It's a party trick. But at the time, scientists at reputable institutions were actually investigating Geller's abilities. Stanford Research Institute brought him into the lab, put him under a microscope, not literally, but you get the idea, and watched as he did some things that looked remarkable. Did physics just take a day off for Uri Geller, or was something else at play? The answers were, let's say, bendy. With television cameras rolling, Geller would stroke a metal spoon between his fingers, stare at it, with what could only be described as intense psychic constipation. And, wouldn't you know it, the spoon would gently droop, as if embarrassed at all the attention. Viewers gasped. Scientists scratched their heads. Skeptics grabbed their notepads. Geller would often instruct people at home to try bending spoons themselves, and some even swore it worked. The truth is, with the right amount of pressure and a little misdirection, most teaspoons are deeply suggestible. But nobody wanted to admit this was the most expensive magic show ever funded by public television. The big tidal wave of skepticism started rolling when James Randi, an ex-magician turned steadfast debunker, entered the scene. Randi, armed with nothing but logic and a bag of unbent spoons, dissected Geller's performances in painstaking detail. According to Randy, Geller wasn't channeling psychic powers. He was using classic sleight-of-hand techniques that would make even a Vegas magician yawn. In other words, there's a reason magicians never starve. But even as the critics pounced, Geller's popularity boomed. He authored books, headlined television specials, and even attempted to unlock ancient mysteries and padlocks with his mind powers. For years, newspapers trumpeted debates over whether he was the real deal or just the world's best silverware salesman. Scientists, divided between credulity and common sense, threw around terms like psychokinesis and confirmation bias, like pepper on a steak. Here's the kicker. Uri Geller never really proved, under strictly controlled conditions, that he could bend a spoon with nothing but his mind. But he absolutely bent the public consciousness. He's emblematic of a peculiar phenomenon. People want to believe. And, let's be honest, at a certain point, the only thing getting twisted was our sense of reality. To this day, you'll catch Geller defending his abilities. His legacy, somewhere between performer and provocateur, is a tangle of genuine wonder, showmanship, controversy, and, unfortunately for many, slightly misshapen cutlery. Spoon bending, then, isn't about the spoons. It's about how easily human minds can be bent by spectacle, hope, and a dash of trickery. In the end, maybe the real party trick was convincing us to believe in the impossible, if only for a moment, just before dessert. Is it possible the Greeks snuck into Troy in a wooden horse the size of a 3-story condo? Or was that just Homer's fan fiction? For centuries, the saga of the Trojan horse has trotted through classrooms, epic poems, and Hollywood blockbusters, always presented as a cunning masterstroke of Greek subterfuge. But set aside the popcorn. Does this tall tale stand up to scrutiny? Or is it, well, just tall? First, let's unbox the logistics. According to Homer's Odyssey and Virgil's Aeneid, the Greeks spent a decade camped outside Troy's walls, growing weary of war and cunning in their desperation. Enter Odysseus, the original outside-the-box thinker. He suggests the Greeks build an enormous wooden horse, hollow it out, cram it with their best warriors, then pretend to sail away, leaving this oversized art installation as a peace offering. And it gets wilder. The Trojans, elated by their apparent victory, drag the horse inside the gates, ignore every red flag in sight, and party so hard they fail to notice a squad of Greeks sneaking out of the horse in the dead of night. Cue the sacking of Troy. Curtain falls. But let's ask, could any ancient city, even one as grand as Troy, physically accommodate a multi-story wooden horse on wheels and then blithely roll it inside without at least one engineering? Major, pointing out the logistical flaws. Skeptics point out the intimidating weight. We're talking tons of timbers, enough labour to rival an HGTV time-lapse, all completed under the nose of their enemies. Then there's the space inside. Have you ever tried stuffing even a couple of grown adults into a crawl space, let alone a detachment of armour-clad warriors? Either ancient Greeks were masters of yoga, or Homer was stretching more than his verse. Some historians say the story is, at best, poetic license, mythologized over centuries until the symbolic Trojan horse became a literal Trojan horse. In this reading, the horse may not have been a piece of sculpture, but a metaphor. Horses were associated with Poseidon, a god of earthquakes and the sea, both of which might hint at Troy falling to a sudden catastrophic event, an earthquake or even, more chilling, a literal breach via the city's poorly defended gates, sometimes referred to as horse gates in ancient texts. Or the horse could have represented a siege engine, a battering ram, or even a type of war machine concealed under a wooden shell, later reimagined as a gift. On the other hoof, archaeological digs at the presumed site of Troy have uncovered evidence of a city destroyed around the right era, with layers of ash and toppled walls. But alas, nobody's unearthed a single splinter of an ancient equine statue. Either it burned with the rest of Troy, or it never existed in the first place, except in the collective imagination. Regardless of its factual basis, the story's endurance tells us something about human psychology. The Trojan horse encapsulates the irresistible lure of the too-good-to-be-true offer, a cautionary tale in a world where we keep falling for scams, clickbait, and suspiciously large objects left unattended. The Greeks' gift was just a well-packaged ploy, a metaphorical reminder to look a gift horse in the mouth, or at least to X-ray it. So, was the horse a feat of ancient carpentry, or just the ancient world's most successful piece of propaganda? Like so many legendary moments, the answer sits precariously atop a stack of myths, memories, and maybe a grain or two of fact. Choose your side: Homeric history or historical Homerism. Either way, the real Trojan horse may be the belief that any story, repeated enough times, can become reality, gift-wrapped or not. How did those stones get there? Is it druids, aliens, or was it just several centuries of, hey, let's move these heavy rocks and see what happens? No episode about history's greatest mysteries is complete without a stop at Stonehenge, that iconic ring of massive stones out on the Salisbury Plain, as mysterious as your friend's Wi-Fi password. It's a monument that's been featured in everything from sober archaeology textbooks to late-night alien hunter specials. The focus isn't whether the stones are impressive. Everybody agrees they are. It's who, or what, orchestrated this Neolithic engineering puzzle. Let's start with the aliens did it theory. Yes, it's fun to imagine stone-faced extraterrestrials in shimmering jumpsuits beaming up megaton boulders, but real evidence for ET's masonry apprenticeship is as scarce as actual UFO fuel receipts. The ancient aliens camp points to the precision of the monument, its alignment with astronomical phenomena, and the sheer weight of the stones, some over 25 tons. Surely, they say, no mere mortal could manage it. But, sorry, we can leave the little green men at Area 51 for this one. All credible research so far points toward a most shocking answer. People. But not just any people. We're talking about inventive communities who somehow managed to lug bluestones across 150 miles from Wales, sans bulldozers or forklifts. Recent archaeology suggests a mid-Neolithic population, using cunning techniques, sledges, wooden rollers, and good old-fashioned teamwork. In fact, experimental archaeologists have shown you can move a multi-ton stone using nothing more high-tech than logs, ropes, and enough neighbours who owe you favours. And what about those perfectly aligned stones that frame the solstices? While it's tempting to chalk this up to cosmic intervention, the explanation is even more compelling. Neolithic societies were intensely attuned to natural cycles, for farming or for ritual celebrations. Many ancient sites across the globe, Newgrange in Ireland, for instance, exhibit the same astronomical savvy. If you're tethering your whole existence to the rhythm of the seasons, aligning a monument to the solstice isn't Star Trek level. It's vital, local knowledge. It's like building your house to catch the morning sun. The stakes are just higher if your crops are on the line. Let's take a moment to spare a thought for the Druids. Thanks to 18th and 19th century Romantic poets who couldn't resist a good fantasy, Druids have been forever entangled with Stonehenge. Reality check. The Druids arrived on the British scene about 1,500 years after Stonehenge was already standing tall. likely wondering who on earth left that giant stone circle behind. Modern Stonehenge research is more earthbound, but no less fascinating. Genetic studies and animal bone analysis hint that Stonehenge drew visitors from all over prehistoric Britain, possibly for big seasonal feasts and ceremonies. Animal remains suggest gatherings that put your summer barbecue to shame. Think less landing pad for flying saucers, and more mega annual block party meets moonwatching club. So, the next time you gaze at pictures of Stonehenge, or visit in person after battling a busload of school kids, imagine not otherworldly architects, but communities of determined, inventive people, coordinating backbreaking labour and awe-inspiring rituals, right here on planet Earth. That's not just ancient engineering. It's a testament to human imagination, collaboration, and maybe, just maybe, prehistoric stubbornness. No aliens need apply. The real mystery isn't who built Stonehenge, but just how much pizza they would have needed to finish the project. Sharp teeth, sharp capes, sharper misunderstandings. Was Vlad the Impaler really history's bloodthirstiest monster, or just in desperate need of a rebrand? Let's bite right into it. Centuries before Twilight fans debated Team Edward versus Team Jacob, Europe was already split on a prickly question. Was Vlad the Impaler a pawn of medieval horror propaganda, or the misunderstood anti-hero of his era? Here's a guy whose PR has whiplashed between being the boogeyman used to terrify misbehaving children and, depending on whom you ask, a hard-nosed king keeping the peace with excessive pointiness. The truth, as with most legends, is slicker than a widow's peak. Vlad III, the Impaler to his enemies, Dracula to his family, and please don't invite him to dinner to his neighbours, ruled Wallachia in the mid-15th century. The stories say he dined amongst the impaled, drank blood, and generally made Attila the Hun look like a 12-year-old playing Risk. But importantly, a lot of those stories came from pamphlets printed in German cities, far from the scene and from people who very much wanted Vlad to look as monstrous as possible. In the pre-Twitter era, this was how you went viral. You told horrifying tales at the printing press and let the world's imagination do the rest. We have the Renaissance equivalent of tabloid journalism to thank for Vlad's gnarly reputation. These tales did the rounds in Europe, fueled by wartime politics, commercial rivalries, and, let's face it, the almost irresistible urge for dramatics. Vlad's method of dealing with crime and enemies, publicly and with a sharp stick, landed him a spot just left of Genghis Khan on the people to avoid at dinner parties list. But, weirdly, in his homeland, he was the OG anti-corruption crusader, defending his people against the encroaching Ottoman Empire with bristling, if morally questionable, efficiency. In Romania today, he gets a rather mixed Yelp review. Terrifying, yes, but also decisive, even loyal. Enter Bram Stoker in 1897, upgrading Vlad to the ultimate aristocratic nightcrawler. Dracula wasn't just about evil anymore. He became a symbol of the exotic, the mysterious, and, presumably, the impracticability of wearing white-collar shirts. Ironically, while Stoker's novel borrowed Vlad's nickname and little else, he managed to weld real history with Victorian anxieties about the foreign, the monstrous, and, let's not kid ourselves, the enduring popularity of a good, old-fashioned bloodbath. Thanks to novels, movies, cereal mascots, and even vacation packages, Dracula's reputation mutated from a possibly misunderstood warlord into a universal shorthand for don't trust tall, dark strangers in formal wear. Tonista, villain or hero, If you lived in 15th century Bucharest and Vlad rode into town, you'd likely hide the kebab skewers and hope he was just passing through. If you were a foreign pamphleteer, you might lovingly, if not entirely accurately, exaggerate his exploits to fill some extra columns. And if you were Bram Stoker, you'd take the ugliest parts, throw in a dash of supernatural flair, and create a monster that sells popcorn for 100 years and counting. In the end, Vlad's legacy is part cruel tyrant, part patriotic defender, and part brilliantly botched PR campaign. Maybe the real bloodsuckers were the people at the printing press, or the centuries of storytellers who couldn't resist a pointy-toothed villain. One thing's certain, history loves a bad guy. But poor Vlad might just be history's greatest example of never let your enemies write your LinkedIn profile. Whether you champion him as a national hero or clutch your garlic a little tighter at bedtime, remember, sometimes monsters are made, not born, and sometimes it's all just a matter of who's telling the story. So tonight, as you shut your eyes and drift off, think about all the weirdly persistent, slightly embarrassing, but endlessly entertaining myths that pepper our history. For centuries, people survived lice, plague, tomatoes, and at least one guy trying to invent gravity by napping under a fruit tree. But they also survived misinformation, sometimes their own, sometimes spread by a Renaissance meme, sometimes just because someone thought it sounded funny at dinner. Be grateful tonight, not just for memory foam pillows and Wi-Fi, but that you don't have to wear a chastity belt or prove the Earth's roundness to a crowd of angry villagers. Our ancestors had spunk, imagination, and a flair for the dramatic, even if they couldn't always get their facts straight. History may be confusing, but at least it's taught us one thing. People remain hopeful, stubborn, and just a little bit weird. Good night, and may your dreams be myth-free. Unless you want a little company from a horned Viking or a Great Wall sighting from the comfort of your bed. Sleep well.